In this video, we are going to talk about a type of simulation called agent-based modeling. Now, what distinguishes an agent-based model is that it works by trying to represent a system as a set of interacting agents. And each of those agents is represented within the computer, right? So the computer keeps track of each one of those agents. And so you can have quite simple um, rules for how those agents interact with each other, but you can then see quite complex patterns emerge from that simulation. So agent-based models are very popular in the social sciences because we're often interested in simulating how humans might behave, and humans obviously vary a lot as individuals, which is hard to capture in traditional forms of modeling where you try to come up with an equation that describes the whole system, right? Human behavior is so complex that we don't really governed by a single equation. Um, but you can try and create a model in which a bunch of individuals are interacting and see what results emerge from that simulation. So some examples are looking at voting behavior and how political polarization might emerge from relatively simple means of interacting. They're common in economics as well, right? Looking at how the economic results might emerge from just the ways that individuals make economic decisions. Um, and then, they have uses as well in things like traffic flow and planning, right? Where you can create models of how individuals might move around an environment and see what results. They're also used in the natural sciences, like ecology, where we're studying the behavior of animals, kind of like how in the social sciences we might be studying the behavior of humans. Um, so we can look at how ecosystems evolve. We can also look at how diseases might spread through populations, uh, and things like evolution and movement as well. So an agent-based model is particularly valuable when we're trying to study a system that has particular conditions. So one is when it matters that we represent the people or the entities in that system as individuals, and we care about their interactions and maybe different scenarios in which interactions are different. And also when a system is complex, right? If a system is complex enough, we might just not be able to create an equation-based model that simplifies the whole system down into an equation. And instead, we need to use a model where we track individuals and see what behavior emerges. So let's take a look at an example. And in this example, we're going to look at how birds might fly around in a flock. So you've probably seen a flock of birds flying through the sky, and they often look like they're moving in some sort of coordinated pattern, right? Each bird's movement is coordinated with other birds in the flock, but there's no obvious communication going on between them, right? So how do they coordinate their flight? Well, we can try modeling a flock of birds as an agent-based model, and what we'll say is that each agent in this model is a bird, and each of these birds can move around in space. In the example we'll look at here, we're just going to move around in two-dimensional space, right, in the x-axis direction and in the y-axis direction. And each of our birds, each of our agents, will adjust its movement as the model progresses to try and match the movement of the birds or the agents that are closest to it in the simulation, right? So it's kind of like in each instance, you look at how the birds around you are moving and you try and do the same thing, right? While at the same time, each of those birds is also doing the same adjustment, okay? So here's an example of how that might look in a computer, right? uh, each bird is represented by a row in this data frame. Right? So we have an ID, which represents a unique bird, and we're going to keep track of the time step. Right? So we're going to step through time with our model. And then we have two columns, X and Y, which track the position of each bird in two-dimensional space. And then finally, we have these columns Vx and Vy, which track the speed of each bird. In this case, we're looking at the component of speed in the X direction and the component of speed in the Y direction. Now, there are more than 3 birds in this simulation, right? We're just looking at the first few rows here of this data frame. And so what happens as we allow this agent-based model to evolve over multiple time steps? Well, we can run this simulation and look at the results. And this is what we see if we try to visualize the patterns of motion. Okay, so this is a graph where each dot represents an agent, right? One of our model's birds. And the graph shows a frame for each step of the simulation. And we can see how the birds are sort of collectively moving, and they do seem to be moving in some sort of unison, right? And you can adjust the parameters of the model to try and see how that affects the behavior, right? You could say, well, how close does each bird care about when it's adjusting its movement based on other birds, right? Does it care only about birds that are right next to it, or is it going to look further afield as well? Okay, and that might affect the results of your model. So we can compare the pros and cons of agent-based models versus the more traditional equation-based modeling approach, right? And so with equation-based models, what we're really looking at is sort of the average behavior of all the entities in the system, right? Trying to capture that in a single equation. Whereas an agent-based model, we can have individual differences, right? So in our flocking simulation from the previous slide, we could have allowed different birds to behave in different ways, right? Some birds could have only cared about birds that were really close. Others could have also have cared about birds that were further away, which is related to the second line, right? That in equation models, we're forced pretty much to basically treat everyone in the population that we're modeling as being the same, being homogeneous, right? We're essentially assuming everyone acts like the average individual. Whereas in an agent-based model, we can allow that individual variation. Now, one advantage of equation-based models is they tend to be faster, right? Because it's usually relatively quick to solve equations, whereas in an agent-based model, computers tend to take longer to run those, and they also take up a lot more memory because we have to keep track of all these individual agents. At every time step, we have to calculate how they interact with each other and keep track of all that information. And so it can take a lot of time and sometimes very powerful computers to be able to run a complex agent-based model. And if you wanted to model a large system, right? So maybe you wanted to create an agent-based model of the entire United States, for example, right? Well, then you would need 300 million agents in your model if you want it to be accurate. And that would obviously then use a lot of computing power to keep track of all of them. Now, on the flip side, right, with equations, there are limits to just how complex a system we can really represent with an equation. Whereas with agent-based models, right, because all we're doing is usually specifying some fairly simple ways that agents can interact with each other, right, we can then allow that behavior to emerge out of the model without having to specify it ahead of time with an equation.